Good day, or good evening, or good afternoon. And thank you to Long Bui for having invited me to deliver this lecture for the Global and International Studies Forum at UC Irvine. Thanks to Jessica for having helped me organize this, and thank you all for listening. My talk is entitled Mediterranean Imaginaries, and that's what my talk will be about. I'd like to start immediately by sort of showing you how the visual background that you see behind me aims to elicit the point of departure of this talk very visually. That is the idea that the Mediterranean belongs to a class of metageographical objects carved out of land and sea by human imagination. And these metageographies generate discursive and mental images that I call in my book Mediterranean Imaginaries. So let's begin by unpacking both the notion of metageography and that of imaginary, starting from the first. A metageographical entity is essentially a spatial structure through which people order their knowledge of the world. While it is obviously related to space, a metageographical entity and notion acquires, however, a discursive life that goes far beyond any designation of space. Such, for example, is the resonance of geographical concepts like the West or the Third World or even Europe. They may mean something different depending on who says these words, but the point is precisely that they always mean something more than a space that is opposite to the East, that is the West, or a space that is not Europe, North Africa, China, or Russia, that is the Third World. We always mean more than that. So looking at these maps behind me allows us, I think, to appreciate the metageographical substance of Mediterranean imaginaries all at once. So let me start by actually this map here on my other side over here. That is a map, an Arab map of the 12th century that gives us, I think, a perfect example of the metageographical constructions of North and South. As you can see, the South is marked on top and the North comes reversed from our perspective, of course. Well, as soon as we say our perspective, we denaturalize the sense that the North is always on top. This is totally arbitrary. The idea that the North is above and the South is below, it's obviously constructed. And we can't avoid understanding that the essence of being above is always the essence of being superior, the essence of being on top of those who are below, and therefore inherently inferior. We can see that the Arab mind of the 12th century reconstructed this as inverting precisely the Arab world that was designed to go towards a very different kind of perception. But I also want you to notice how the Mediterranean Sea, which is right here, where my finger is, I'm not very coordinated right now, is actually something that it's mimicking the Red Sea that is up here. And so what you have is a kind of, that's where the imaginary construction of the Red Sea and the Mediterranean are mirroring each other because of the importance that they both held for the Arab Muslim world at that time. So what we see, this is where the metageographical notion of actually a Red Sea, like a Mediterranean Sea with its islands, took place. Right behind my head, you have instead an image of a Roman map of the 4th century AD. And what you see here, is actually the Mediterranean, this green narrow strip. And here, I think, an image of the way that the Mediterranean functioned as a privileged waterway of communication in antiquity, but also of the territorialization that this waterway underwent during the Roman Empire. Its restriction to a waterway is precisely the kind of symbolic rendition of the idea of the Mediterranean by Romans, a Mediterranean that was understood and called at the time Mare Nostrum, our sea, and which implied inherently the preeminence of lands over the waters between lands. This map gives us completely different image of the Mediterranean as a river between the continental lands of Africa and Europe. And now, when we look at this other map, I'm sorry, here, my hands are not very coordinated today. The 16th century map speaks to us instead of the Mediterranean of commerce and ports, a 16th century AD map in which you can see the contours of Africa and Europe are actually made up of little strips of red, which are the names of the ports. This was a portland map. And if you look closely at this map, you'll see that there are lines crossing the sea and the land. Well, this is, I think, the best sort of visual representation of what I call the Mediterranean of Emporia, the Mediterranean of city-states and ports and islands that was determined by the sea space and interactions, a fishing net Mediterranean in which the lines actually invade even the continent. And so what we have is that it seems like the fundamental connectivity of the Mediterranean is exported onto the two continents. And in a way, it is Europe and Africa that are mapped as a sea rather than vice versa. So what we have here is a completely different new imaginary. And now look at this one here, sorry, again. This is instead of a map, a map of the sort of a contemporary map of the way in which in which Greeks, Phoenicians, and Etruscans were collaborating in the archaic Mediterranean in the construction of a Mediterranean of Emporia. And I think this is a perfect map to give you the sense of that famous sentence of the Mediterranean as the cradle of civilizations, a map that includes the Black Sea and the whole Mediterranean coastlines. And the Mediterranean, it's almost like really making it into a cradle, even just by design. And finally, I just wanted to show you a map of here of the Mediterranean seen from a contemporary image of what I would call the Mediterranean as a liquid continent. The more contemporaneous idea of the Mediterranean. And notice how the seas of the Mediterranean, the different seas are marked by their acronyms, but it's almost like they're creating countries within the liquid continent. And then the liquid continent expands through waterways and rivers a little bit into the inside. So we have a kind of liquid fluid map of the idea of fluidity, and which is so prominent in contemporary discourses on the Mediterranean. And here is, in fact, where I would like to start my discussion, because over the past 40 years, academic discourse on the Mediterranean has, in fact, exploded, at least in European languages. Thousands of books with the word Mediterranean or Méditerranée or Mediterráneo in their titles or in their keywords, have appeared and continue to appear every year since roughly the early 1990s at a rate never observed before. An explosion of Mediterranean studies, a discursive phenomenon that has been matched by an equally global passion for all things Mediterranean. A sort of Mediterranean pret-a-porter, as I call it in my book, on a genuinely global scale. Just think of the catch-all idea of the Mediterranean diet, or the Hollywood passion for Italian images of Mediterraneanness in Oscar-winning movies like Cinema Paradiso, Mediterraneo, The Postman, and I'm only scratching the surface. And then add to this global image the knowledge that there exists a Mediterranean studies centers even in Kalamazoo. And that, I think, it gives you immediately a sense that there is something global about this desire for Mediterranean. So by and large, I would venture to say that today the word Mediterranean, in both in its adjectival and capitalized form, that is Mediterranean as an adjective of Mediterranean as indicating the sea, the Mediterranean Sea as a locale, in academic, as much as popular cultural discourse, conjures up images and discourses of hybridization, syncretism, creolization, connectivity, and networking. What in my book I call the fishing net or Emporion matrix of Mediterranean imaginaries. That is, a bounded horizon of poetics of relation, as theorized by Caribbean scholar Edouard Glissant, a form of relational belonging, alternative to both the us versus them logic of national identity and to the deracination of globalization. A post-colonial, postmodern Mediterranean imaginary that in a bit of self-ironic fashion, I would claim, allows us to have our post-colonial cake, that is transnational fluidity, and eat it too, without the neoliberal effects of globalization and liquidity in capitalist terms. So my own book is not just a study of the role that Mediterranean imaginaries have played in the making of Italians, but it is in fact an expression of this post-colonial form of Mediterraneanism. That is to say, I plead guilty to it. I plead guilty to the fact that our Mediterranean passion is both a framework, an imaginary framework of the Mediterranean, and one that guides our research into other Mediterranean imaginaries in the past. But I don't think that we are doing any violence to history or geography or reality by admitting that we are part of a resurgence of a Mediterranean imaginary that has a global scale. And in that sense, it is a phenomenon that goes far beyond the limited role that it has in the academy. Our post-colonial Mediterranean is no more imaginary than any that preceded it, but it is also one that conceals a very troubling genealogy, which is marked by coloniality through and through. In what follows, therefore, I'd like, in a certain sense, to strip the carpet off my own feet. I'd like to show how below our contemporary passion for the Mediterranean of Emporia, the fishing net of archaic trading places established by Phoenicians, Greeks, and Etruscans, which has marked, I think, the Mediterranean imaginary of syncretism and hybridity, there lies a discursive genealogy marked by imperium. That is, the Roman paradigm of conquest and territorialization by which the Romans transformed the Mediterranean fishing net of Emporia into what I call an imperial spiderweb that they called Mare Nostrum, RC. So let me then dedicate this lecture to a kind of discursive history in three phases, in three ages actually, of the Mediterranean imaginary or imaginaries. Some of you probably know the monumental work of Fernand Braudel, La Méditerranée et le monde méditerranéen à l'époque de Philippe II, the Mediterranean and the Mediterranean world in the age of Philip II, which this French historian published in 1949 and then revised several times. The term monumental is appropriate for this work, not only because of its length and impact, but also because, like a monument, Braudel's The Mediterranean World speaks to us about both the past it referred to and the present in which it was conceived, which turn out to be both two fundamental moments in the discursive history of the Mediterranean. And I'll come back to the second moment, but I want to, that is the moment in which Braudel produced his book, is I think the moment that inaugurates the contemporary phase of Mediterraneanism, but at the same time, as a book produced on the eve, so as a book produced on the eve of the decolonization of the North African shore of the Mediterranean world marked the beginning of our post-colonial Mediterranean imaginary. But as a longue durée history of the Mediterranean world from antiquity through the 16th century AD or EC, climaxing with its brief and only temporary political unification of the Mediterranean under the Spanish king Philip II, the book written by Braudel points us in the direction of the true birth of the Mediterranean as a meta-geographical discursive entity. The Mediterranean as a noun indicating a sea, whether the word sea was included or left implicit, was literally and literarily born in the linguistic area of Romance languages, and only in those languages in the 1530s, in the age of Philip II. But it was born of an adjective that had never been associated with the sea. I repeat it. It was born of an adjective that had never been associated with the sea. As most of you probably know, the word Mediterranean derives from the Latin adjective Mediterraneus, which comes from the conjunctive adverb medius, that means middle, and the substantive terra. Therefore, we usually translate it the sea between the lands. In its use in Latin prose, however, Mediterraneus was never associated with sea or water. In fact, Mediterraneus implied the absence of water. It meant simply inland, and quite specifically, it referred to objects remote from the sea. It marked, therefore, the exclusion of the sea. The term Mare Nostrum, RC, with which the Romans named what we now call the Mediterranean, confirms that the Romans were not a thalassocracy, that is, a maritime power, even after conquering the Mediterranean. They were and remained a land power and territorialized the sea under their control by naming it RC. So the question is, how did the term Mediterraneus come to produce its opposite? That is, go from signifying the absence of or the exclusion of the sea in antiquity to be identified with the sea in the 16th century AD. The answer for me is clearly related to the so-called voyages of discovery that saw Italian, French, Spanish, and Portuguese sailors and powers crossing the oceans and naming those oceans Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian. The birth of the Mediterranean in those languages, and only in those languages, reflected, therefore, the role that much larger bodies of water had come to play in the imaginary of those people. But what is most important to underline here is that the metaphorization of Mediterranean from adjective to noun carried with it the mark of conquest and exclusion that characterized its use in Roman times. To begin with, the Mediterranean, qua metaphor, set out to conquer other seas. All the myriads of seas with their local names related to the coastlines they bathed. And it conquered it to establish its hegemony over them as a name, as a noun, thereby reversing its own being relegated to the status of a minor sea with the emergence of European oceanic consciousness. The Mediterranean, in other words, was a conquest of other seas. Secondly, as we all know, 1492 marked not only the beginning of the age of transcontinental voyages, but also that of expulsion of the Jews and Muslims from Spain, an event that is reflected in the absence of the Mediterranean from those languages. In this respect, the Mediterranean was definitely born as a Christian European lake, that is, a sea belonging to Christianity and Europe. And if we add to this the Protestant Reformation and the Mediterranean under the Spanish crown in this period, certainly this was a Christian Catholic sea par excellence, and it marked a sense of belonging to a certain type of Christianity. Now, the second discursive stage in the metaphorization of the Mediterranean took place, I believe, in the course of the 19th century. So for 2 or 3 centuries, the identification of the Mediterranean as a sea space belonging to Christian Catholic Europe marked it in the European imaginary as a sea belonging to Christianity. It is, I think, in the course of the 19th century that the term began to expand its semantic reach towards notions of Mediterraneanness, that is, Mediterranean civilization, Mediterranean culture, Mediterranean race, Mediterranean identity. It returned to play now a new role as an adjective derived from a noun. In this age of Mediterraneanness, the Mediterranean becomes a plus que metaphor, more than a metaphor, in that it begins to indicate a cultural era composed of a unique climate and population. This process, however, is no longer in the hands and pens of the early colonial powers, but of the new dominant powers of Northern Europe, especially the British, who take the lead in defining the Mediterraneanness in the age of the Grand Tour by reversing the direction of belonging. While in the 16th century, the Mediterranean had belonged to Europe and Christianity, by the 19th century, certain European people began to belong to the Mediterranean, and both were identified as Europe's South. In parallel to Orientalism, that is the cultural construction of Europe's absolute other, the Orient, Meridianism, which is the term that I would like you to introduce here, names the construction of Southern Mediterranean Europe as Europe's internal other, a liminal space between Europe, Asia, and Africa, which Montesquieu metonymically identified with Southern Italy. As the century progressed, this liminality came to suffer the same destiny of all other relations of difference in modernity. Historical temporalization first, and bourgeois hierarchization after. The picturesque Mediterraneanness associated by the Grand Tour tourists in the 18th century with Naples and the Italian South slowly turned into Southern backwardness, an idea of time relative to a normative progress. And vis-a-vis the normative and dominant Northwest of progress and modernity, Mediterranean Europeans acquired indelible marks of the dominated, racial inferiority and femininity. In sum, the metaphoric Southernization of the Mediterranean into the idea of Mediterraneanness as a cultural or racial attribute of Southern Europeans was marked by a new set of exclusions. First, the exclusion of the sea itself in favor of a human geography that sometimes extended to entire nations, especially in the case of the newly minted Italian nation, where the famous hero of the two worlds, Giuseppe Garibaldi, who had been instrumental in the unification process, was, after unification, was said not to have unified Italy, but separated Africa, implying that Italy's south had been separated from Africa, which made, of course, the Mediterranean disappear altogether as a sea in this motto. Second, the exclusion of modernity and progress, which were now reserved for a non-Mediterranean Europe, while European Southerners were seen as atavistic and therefore fundamentally incapable or with arrested development. But most importantly, I think it's the third element in this discourse of Mediterraneanness, which actually implies its coloniality. The concept of coloniality, as argued by Cujano, is an important concept for us to understand. Coloniality marks the absorption of certain categories by dominated elites that utilize those categories in order to make other dominated subjects. And so it's the acceptance of subordination within certain categories, the absorption of those categories by certain elites that then displace those onto other dominated subjects. So coloniality is fundamental to understand that in a sense, the conquest of Mediterraneanness, the metaphorics of Mediterraneanness actually begin to conquer the very subjects they indicated as belonging to Mediterraneanness. Mediterraneanness continued to be marked by conquest, but in this phase of their own subjects, that is Spanish, French, and Italian elites, in the sense that these elites accepted their own discursive subordination to the logic of meridianism by defining themselves as Latin Mediterraneans in order to simultaneously separate themselves from and buttress their own colonial claims over North Africa. This appropriation of Mediterraneanness by Southern Europeans marked the beginning of what I call the age of Mediterraneanism, or that is the third phase in the construction of Mediterranean imaginaries. This third stage, we can say that in this third stage, Mediterranean imaginaries begin to assume the consistencies of ideologies, that is, Mediterraneanisms. The appropriation of Mediterraneanness from the exogenous discourse by Northern Europeans that by which Northern Europeans had defined Southern Europeans in the first half of the 19th century, this appropriation now by the triad of self-defined Mediterranean Europeans, that is Spanish, French, and Italians in particular, is put in the service of their imperial biopolitics. And it rotates around the idea of a right to return to North Africa or Turkey, as the case be, to complete the civilizing mission initiated by the Latin Roman ancestors. Latin Mediterraneanisms are buttressed, in fact, by the theorization of the Mediterranean race by both French and Italian racial scientists, a race that is seen as unifying people on both shores of the Mediterranean. Furthermore, this Mediterraneanist discourse by self-defined Mediterraneans for Mediterraneans finds cultural expression in a host of cultural forms and discourses emerging around the same time in France, Spain, and even Greece. From the architecture of Antoni Gaudí in Catalonia and Le Corbusier in France, to the review of Le Cahiers du Sur and the definition of the Mediterranean as a liquid continent by Gabriel Audizio, to the New Odyssey by Nikos Kazantzakis. All this discourse defines a self-conscious Mediterraneanism that is part and parcel of the elites of Mediterraneans for Mediterraneans, Europeans, of course. But it is, of course, in Italy, and precisely in the rise to power of fascism, that Mediterraneanism reaches its cultural political apex in the first half of the 20th century. Under Mussolini's regime, the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, more than Rome itself, becomes the unifying trope among the imperial policies of expansion that involved both the violent pacification of Libya in the 1920s. Libya had been conquered, of course, before fascism came to power by the liberal government in 1911, 1912, and the military occupation of Ethiopia by the fascists in 1935. But I was saying, it became a unifying trope between among this imperial policy, the scientific theorization of Italians as an Aryo-Mediterranean race, and Italian modernist artists' identification of the Mediterranean as their primary symbolic source for fencing off accusations of racial degeneration or cultural atavism. Clearly then, this third phase in the discursive evolution of Mediterranean imaginaries, which took place in the first half of the 20th century, is characterized by continuity with the matrix of territorialization, exclusion, and conquest that had marked the first two phases. In this respect, Italian fascism gave full expression to the imperium unconscious that had characterized the metaphorization of the Mediterranean from its inception. And yet, it is not by chance that Brodel's book would emerge from the ashes of the Nazi-fascist project of world domination by making the Mediterranean Sea the subject of a history of oscillation between permanence and change against the history of events in progressive time. Brodel, first of all, produced a quintessentially anti-fascist manifesto, one that rejected the ideas connected to fascism of the great white man's history, the history-making fascism, the history-making nation, and also inaugurated a new discourse that reversed the metaphorization of the Mediterranean back towards the sea itself, its fluidity of forms, the oscillation of its waves. In that respect, the metaphor of oscillation between permanence and change that Brodel's book foregrounded by means of making the Mediterranean a geographical subject of history and agent of history, not only was an anti-fascist manifesto of a historian that understood a new form of history as defeating the kind of progressive view that the fascists had been very successfully been able to mobilize, but it was also indicating something that went in the direction of proposing oscillation versus the idea of dialectics, the idea of dialectic resolutions and the constant advancement of teleological progress. And I think that this sense of oscillation had a lot to do with the fluidity of waves and the kind of maritime imaginary that certainly Brodel, still steeped in a very Eurocentric consciousness, was capable to capture. As Peregrine Horden and Nicolas Purcell have argued in their 2000 classic, The Corrupting Sea, Brodel's book instituted a history of the Mediterranean that focused on the relationships between coastlines, ports, and islands connected by the medium of the salted water, breaking off from the history of nations in the Mediterranean. And along this discursive line connecting Brodel to Horden and Purcell, we also find Predrag Matvejevich's celebration of Mediterranean maritime life and history in his 1987 classic Breviario Mediterraneo, written first in Italian and then translated as Mediterranean Cultures in English much later, as well as Jacques Derrida's 1991 call for Europe to follow its meta-geographical heading towards the North African shore of the Mediterranean in order to free itself from its own enslavement to both capital and capitals, that is, neoliberalism and national identities. In this respect, this last contemporary phase of metaphorization concerns at last the Mediterranean Sea as sea, a liquid continent that opposes the poetics of belonging to the logics of identity and the eternal surprise of others to the binarism of self and other, capital S and capital O. Of course, for the past 20 years, Europe has refused to head towards the northern shore of Africa, and its encounters with the thousands of others who seek refuge from the legacies of European colonialism in the African continent have been marked by rejection and fear. But it is equally clear that the history and destiny of European values and culture is being played at sea on the ports and islands of the Mediterranean. The metaphorics of what Italian sociologist Franco Cassano has called Mediterranean thought are still far from being largely shared or realized, but they are no longer aimed at conquering or excluding Muslims, Arab, Turkish others. This time, they're aimed at conquering European minds to purge them of their structural meridianism. And so I would conclude paraphrasing the founding motto of Italian nationalism: Italy is made, and now we have to make Italians, that the time might have come to finally make Mediterraneans. Thank you very much.